One of my favorite things to do on the channel is go back and look at previous lists or rankings and see how they did in retrospect. I've had a couple videos like that blow up on the channel, and today I thought I'd take a look at some of the preseason SEC quarterback ranking list and see just how bad or how good they ended up being. I ended up picking one from Saturday Down South, and we're going to go through where they ranked each and every SEC quarterback, and we'll talk about if that was a good or a bad pick, and see how it all ended up. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and go back in time and look at this preseason quarterback rankings list from the SEC. Okay, so at number 16, they ended up having Diego Pavia. Yeah, maybe he didn't set the world on fire in terms of stats, but Pavia is one of the best quarterbacks Vanderbilt has ever seen. Going back in time, he ended up coming out of the state of New Mexico and had pretty much no offers. He had to go the junior college route before ending up at New Mexico State, where he started a couple of years there and even went and beat an SEC team on the road in Auburn. Pavia would battle it out with Nate Johnson for the starting job this year, and after many thought Johnson would win, Pavia instead would win. This past season, he completed 59% of his passes, passed for 2,100 yards, and had 17 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. He also ran for 716 yards and 6 more touchdowns on the ground, but Pavia's it factor is what made him so much better. He's one of the toughest players I've ever seen. He willed Vanderbilt at times and also pulled off some incredible moments. He ended up helping them beat number 1 Alabama 40-35, and in that game, he ended up having 2 touchdowns. He also helped them go on the road and beat Kentucky, went on the road and beat Auburn, and also knocked off a big-time preseason favorite, Virginia Tech, in Week 1. I'm not sure if Pavia has any more eligibility, but ranking him at number 16 in retrospect is criminal. At number 15, they had quarterback Lenora Sellers from South Carolina. The Gamecocks had also brought in Auburn transfer Robbie Ashford, but many thought that Shane Beamer would go ahead and go with redshirt freshman Lenora Sellers. Coming out of Florence, South Carolina, he was a late riser in the class of 2023, and he flipped around between Virginia Tech and Syracuse before ending up at South Carolina. He was also eventually listed as a blue chip recruit, and in minimal playing time in 2023 as the backup to Spencer Rattler, he had a couple of moments. He had a crazy pass against Furman and a crazy run against Vanderbilt, and combining that with his iconic goggles, many were excited for what Sellers could do in 2024. It ultimately was a slow start for him. Ended up being somewhat of a slow start for Sellers though, as South Carolina would lose 3 of their first 5 games, but then he would go crazy. In the 6 games he played, he led them to 6 straight wins, including victories against number 10 Texas A&M, number 23 Missouri, and number 12 Clemson. Sellers had that crazy run to beat the Tigers, and he was a true definition of a dual-threat quarterback. He could make good plays with his arms, and when things broke down, he could make plays with his legs. In my opinion, he also has the it factor, and in retrospect, nobody could really predict it, but Lenora Sellers should be ranked much higher than 15th, and that ended up being a bad take. Okay, so at number 14, they had Blake Shapen. Coming out of Shreveport, Louisiana, Shapen was a 3-star recruit. He'd end up arriving at Baylor as part of the class of 2020, and would get a chance to play in the Big 12 championship game. He ended up putting up decent numbers there, but in 2022 and 2023, he left a lot to be desired. He did combine for nearly 5,000 yards and over 30 touchdowns, but Shapen was looking for one more opportunity to expand his game. He ended up going to Mississippi State to play in Jeff Levy's system, and after throwing for 974 yards with 8 touchdowns and 1 interception, Shapen would be lost for the rest of the season due to injury. I'm not really quite sure where to rank him, as he didn't play a whole lot, and Mississippi State obviously didn't win a lot either, but in my personal opinion, I'd probably have him near the bottom, so being ranked at 14th was probably about correct for him. At number 13, they had Peyton Thorne, the quarterback for Auburn. I never quite understood the Peyton Thorne hype, as coming out of high school, he was a 3-star player who flipped from Western Michigan to Michigan State. He obviously had that great season with the Spartans. He obviously had 2 good years with the Spartans in 2021 and 2022, including that breakout 2021 campaign with Kenneth Walker, but after he transferred to Auburn, it was just terrible. He threw for 1,700 yards and 16 touchdowns last year, but more importantly, he really couldn't get anything going, looked outmatched, and just didn't have the physical look to make it in the SEC. That's why I never understood why there was any hype to Peyton Thorne, and in 2024, it only got nominally better. He did end up throwing for 2,700 yards with 21 touchdowns and 9 interceptions, but he single-handedly cost them a couple of games, which could have helped them go bowling, and he was on and off the bench all season long. I think ranking him at 13 was way too high in the preseason, and I would now have him ranked lower at the end of the season. Despite having nearly 11,000 passing yards, Peyton Thorne's career is now done, and I think was still somewhat underwhelming, especially at Auburn. At number 12, they had Taylon Green. Coming out of Louisville, Texas, Taylon Green was a 3-star recruit and would end up going to Boise State. At the end of the 2022 season, Green would break out, throwing for 2,000 yards and 14 touchdowns with 10 more scores on the ground, and he was getting a ridiculous amount of hype going into 2023. Sadly, Taylon would not live up to expectations in 2023, so when he entered the 2024 transfer portal, he wasn't really talked about that much. Arkansas had to move in a new direction at quarterback and decided to bring in Taylon Green, and this past year, he ended up having a solid season. He threw for 2,800 yards with 13 touchdowns and 9 interceptions, and also had 521 yards and 7 scores on the ground. Still though, Taylon was a mixed bag. He still looks like he's not fully developed, he struggled with turnovers at times, and just hasn't put it all together yet. I think he has pretty much unlimited potential, and maybe in one more year at Arkansas we can fully realize it, but for now, I'd say that ranking was pretty accurate, and that's about where I'd have him. One guy who had a ridiculous amount of hype in the preseason was Brock Vandagriff. They listed him as the number 11 quarterback in the SEC, and I guess you could say it was for good reason. He spent a couple of years on the bench at Georgia behind Stetson Bennett and Carson Beck, and the former Prince Avenue Christian 5-star recruit would end up finally getting his opportunity as he beat out Gavin Wimsatt for the starting job at Kentucky. Sadly though, things would not go according to plan for Brock this year as he ended up throwing for 1,600 yards with 10 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. It was an absolute disaster at times. Kentucky's offense was pretty much stuck in the mud, and Brock could just never figure it out. It seemed like his confidence was shattered, and we'll see if he even gets another year. I'm not sure if Coach Stoops can afford to trot him out again next year, and unless he really proves it this summer and wins a good quarterback battle over another good player, Brock Vandagriff might be running out of time, and he might be considered one of the bigger busts in the last few years at the quarterback position. Another former 5-star recruit who had trouble putting it all together in 2024 in his first year as a starter was Jackson Arnold. We all know about him. He went to Denton Guyer High School and put up crazy numbers in the Texas high school football system, and the top 10 recruit chose to go to Oklahoma. After sitting behind Dylan Gabriel, Arnold would take over in their bowl game and then was groomed to be the next big thing for 2024. Sadly, Arnold would not have a good year, as in total he finished with 1,400 yards with 12 touchdowns and 3 picks, but had a couple of disastrous moments. He played so bad against Tennessee that he was benched at halftime, and he also single-handedly lost their game against Mizzou as he fumbled the ball to Zion Young, and Mizzou went ahead and won that game. Arnold's confidence also looked shot this past season, and to be fair, it sounds like he was put in a bad system that was pretty different from his high school system, so he was sort of set up to fail. Still though, Arnold needs a clean slate, and he entered the 2025 transfer portal and will look to find a new beginning and hopefully save his career, but being ranked at number 10 was ultimately a crime. I think the same thing can be said for Graham Mertz. At one point, coming out of Overland Park, Kansas, Mertz blew up into one of the top quarterbacks in the country and ended up being the highest rated quarterback to ever go to Wisconsin. He also had that crazy first game against Illinois, but sadly the next 3 years were plagued with mediocrity and untapped potential. After the 2022 season, Mertz would transfer to Florida, and in 2023, he threw for 3,000 yards and 20 touchdowns, but Florida struggled to win games. In 2024, Mertz was given a decent amount of hype, as he was ranked as the number 9 quarterback on this list, but pretty early on, we realized he wasn't all that good, and then he got injured, and his season was over. True freshman quarterback would then take over for the rest of the season, and Graham Mertz in total finished with 791 yards and 6 touchdowns. It is kind of hard to rank him because he did get hurt and missed most of the year, but based on how they were going, I'd say that Mertz deserved to be near the bottom of the list, and Florida probably doesn't have that second half resurgence if Mertz was behind center. At number 8, we had first-time starter Garrett Nussmeier from LSU. He was part of the class of 2021 coming out of Lake Charles, Louisiana, and he waited his turn. He didn't get an opportunity to play much in his first 3 years at LSU, but after starting in their bowl game, the team sort of rallied behind him, and he was their guy in 2024. In total, Nussmeier ended up throwing for 3,700 yards with 26 touchdowns and 11 interceptions, and was a true pro-style player as he could not run or scramble at all. Nussmeier started out so strong that he was considered a first-round draft pick, but in the back half of the season, LSU would collapse, and after that Texas A&M game, Nussmeier's numbers fell apart, and his confidence was broken. I'm not quite sure what happened, but at one point I would have had Nussmeier as a top 5 quarterback, but honestly that number 8 spot sounds pretty good for him, and that's probably where I would have him right now. At number 7, they had quarterback Nico Iamaleava from Tennessee. Rumor has it, he was paid $9 million coming out of high school to go to Tennessee, and Nico was a big deal. He was a top 5 recruit and was seen as a generational quarterback prospect for the Vols. After 1 year of Joe Milton, Nico would take over in their bowl game last year, running for 4 touchdowns against Iowa. Nico had an incredible start to the 2024 college football season, but would end up tapering off by the end of it. He threw for 2,500 yards with 19 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, and also ran for 300 more and 1 touchdown. Nico was sort of night and day, as some games he disappeared and other games he went crazy. I mean, he had 8 touchdowns in his final 2 combined games, but there was one point in the season, but he didn't even have touchdowns against either Arkansas or Florida. In my opinion, he's still a year away from being a college football superstar, and I think the brakes need to be pumped on him a little bit, but I would still have Nico ranked in the back half of the top 10, and he has so much promise for 2025. Another 5-star who didn't have a great year was Connor Weigman. Coming out of Cypress, Texas, Weigman blew up and became a big deal in the class of 2022. His first 2 years were kind of odd, as he took over at the end of the 2022 season as a true freshman and had some solid games, and then would start the first half of the 2023 season before he would go down with an injury. Going into 2024, he was seen as a top 10 draft pick and a guy who could help Texas A&M football reach the top. Mike Elko was super pumped for him, but ultimately he had a terrible game against Notre Dame, dealt with an injury, and then sort of got passed up by Marcel Reed. In total, Weigman threw for 819 yards with 3 touchdowns and 5 picks, and his only decent game seemingly came against Mizzou. Weigman saw the writing on the wall and decided to enter the 2025 transfer portal, where he's probably going to go to another SEC school in my opinion. But right now he's predicted all over the place, and I have no idea where he will land. But just like Jackson Arnold and Brock Vandegrift, this former 5-star was not able to get it done, and there's no way in heck he'd be ranked as the 6th best guy in my list. At number 5, they had Brady Cook. Growing up in St. Louis, Cook was a Mizzou fan, but was never seen as the future of the program. He was just a 3-star recruit coming out of high school, and many thought he'd be passed up by more talented players or transfers, including myself. As a Mizzou fan, I was definitely critical of his 2022 season, but apparently he was playing hurt. Finally, in 2023, Cook had his best season in a Mizzou uniform, throwing for 3,300 yards with 21 touchdowns, and he also had 8 more scores on the ground. He led them to a couple of huge victories, and it looked like Brady Cook was going to be one of the top quarterbacks in the country in 2024. I'm not quite sure what happened though, as something with his arm was messed up, and he dealt with injuries on and off all season, and Cook only managed to throw for 2,200 yards with 9 touchdowns and 2 picks this year, but he did end up having 5 more scores on the ground. Cook led Mizzou to a 9-3 regular season record, and had a couple of big moments, including the game-winning touchdown run on senior night against Arkansas, but I would not have him ranked as a top 5 quarterback in the SEC this year. He's kind of like Diego Pavia in my eyes, as he found a way to win games and manage the offense, but his stats weren't going to pop off the page. I might be a little bit biased as well, but I'd still have Brady Cook as a top 10 quarterback in the SEC this year, and I do wonder if his season would have been better had he not had all those injuries. Okay, at number 4, they had Jackson Dart. Personally, in my opinion, I had him as a top 2 quarterback in the SEC, but after coming out of high school in Utah, Dart would spend part of his time at USC before transferring to Ole Miss. He's now become one of the best quarterbacks in school history at Ole Miss, as he's thrown for nearly 3,000 yards and over 20 touchdowns in each of the past 3 years. Dart this season ended up throwing for 3,875 yards with 25 touchdowns and 6 picks, with nearly 500 more yards and 3 scores on the ground. Sadly though, Dart will be remembered for some mistakes, as against Florida, he seemingly threw 15 straight interceptions. I know it was like 2, but they lost that game to Florida. Because of that, they're going to be out of the college football playoff. The overtime loss to LSU also stings, and that terrible home loss to Kentucky. But Dart still put up crazy numbers, and in my opinion is probably a 1st or 2nd round draft pick, so I would still honestly have him as a top 2, if not the number 1 guy in the SEC. At number 3, they had quarterback Jalen Milroe from Alabama. Coming out of Texas, Milroe was seen as a blue chip recruit and would eventually flip from Texas to Bama near signing day, and Milroe would end up being a backup his first 2 years on campus. He got a little bit of time when Bryce Young got hurt for that game, but then in 2023, he would take over. After a slow start, Milroe would take over by the end of the year, throwing for 2,800 yards with 23 touchdowns and 12 more scores on the ground. He was seen as a top 3 Heisman frontrunner going into 2024, but this season was sort of up and down for him. In total, Milroe threw for 2,700 yards with 15 touchdowns and 10 picks, but did a lot of damage on the ground, running for 719 yards and 20 touchdowns. Milroe ended up having 35 total touchdowns, but just like Dart, he'll be remembered for his bad performances. He didn't play very well in that loss to Vanderbilt, was terrible in their loss to Tennessee, and then was egregious in their game against Oklahoma. Just like Dart, Milroe had those 3 bad games, but still at the end of the day, Milroe's a first-round NFL draft pick, and his production was pretty insane. Okay, at number 2, we have Quinn Ewers from Texas. In my opinion, this situation is sort of like Brady Cook, as Quinn Ewers has an asterisk on his name because we don't really know how that injury would end up affecting him. Obviously, he was the #1 player in the country at one point and reclassified and went to Ohio State before taking over as the starter in 2022. Ewers threw for 3,500 yards in 2023 and led Texas to the college football playoff, but he was not satisfied, so he decided to come back in 2024. This past season, Ewers threw for 2,300 yards with 24 touchdowns and also had one more score on the ground, but as I said, he ended up dealing with an injury. Ewers would only play in 10 of the team's 12 games, and also a couple games he didn't play as much because of garbage time. He had a couple of big performances, including 5 touchdowns against Florida, 3 touchdowns on the road against Michigan, and 3 scores in a win over Vanderbilt. At times, I'd say Ewers was a little bit underwhelming, but I would still keep him in my top 4. I'm not quite sure if there was a more confusing quarterback in the SEC this year than Carson Beck. After originally committing to Bama, the blue chip recruit from Jacksonville would decide to go to Georgia and sat behind Stetson Bennett for a couple of years before he'd take over as the starter in 2023. Last season, Beck became one of the best quarterbacks in college football, throwing for nearly 4,000 yards with 24 touchdowns and 4 more scores on the ground. He was seen as the Heisman frontrunner and the projected #1 overall pick, but sadly, Beck did not have a great 2024 season. But Beck had a really weird 2024 season. He ended up throwing for nearly 3,500 yards and actually had a career-high 28 touchdowns, but he also doubled his interception numbers to 12, and just like Dart and Milroe, had a couple of really dumb games. Against #1 Texas, he ended up having 3 interceptions without a touchdown, and then he also played terrible in a game against Ole Miss and struggled badly against Kentucky. It just kind of depended on the day for Carson Beck, and literally just like Dart and Milroe, he had 3 bad games. But I would easily keep Carson Beck in the top 4. So yeah, today we went through the preseason rankings of all the SEC quarterbacks, and honestly, I'm just going to go ahead and show you my list, and you can let me know your thoughts down below. What did I get right and wrong? What do you disagree with? And should I do this for other conferences or positions? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you did support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out one of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.